Hello, welcome to another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at Volume 11, Issue 1, Blotting Out the Sun, Archers in the Ancient World. I'm joined by Marc DeSantis, Marc McCaffery, and it's a welcome back to Jasper, who once more is editor of the magazine. So Jasper, this is the first time you've been on the podcast in literally years, and this is your first full issue back as editor. I wondered how this issue came about. Archers looks like you've pulled a real crowd pleaser out of the bag to return with a bang.
It's actually, that's up to Yosho. He set the theme for this issue. He collected the proposals, though I think we did make the choices together. So I took it from there. So that's still mostly to his credit. I've been messing with the rest of the year, but no, the choice in this case was his.
So which is the first one that's your suggestion of topic?
Well, strictly speaking, that's going to be the next one. I mean, Yosho set the themes for the whole year, but 11.2, it was supposed to be Magna Graecia, so the Greek cities in southern Italy. And when I looked at the proposals that I got, they were extremely diverse. And I've been looking at various reference works about battles that be big enough to have a long piece on and have sort of a coherent theme. And that seemed like it was going to be difficult. So I made an executive decision, as they say, and being more of a Roman person than Yosho is, I was like, oh, let's put it into the Roman sphere, and it's become sort of the if you look at it, I did what's it called? A Multitude of Peoples, Ancient Warfare issue 4/1. That's the very first issue that sold out after the very, very first range that had very small circulation, which is about all the peoples in Italy around sort of in the mid 4th century BC. And then Yosho did 7.3, which was on the, I've got it here actually, Conquerors of Italy, the early Roman Republic, which is just kind of funny. I looked at them side by side, and 4.1 is much more about various peoples and what kind of warriors they had, and 7.3 is much more about the various, it has 2 or 3 battles in it, I think. It's a lot more historical, sort of narrative. And 11.2 looks like it's going to be sort of plugging the hole between those two, and then what was my last issue before Yosho took over, 6.4, Pyrrhus. So I'm just sort of playing Tetris with themes here. And it's about sort of that last phase of, the end of the Samnite Wars, and it's becoming very clear that, Italy is going to be Roman. It just might take a little longer, but it's going to be an unstoppable force.
I have a feeling that if you look on YouTube, that Pyrrhus is our most popular YouTube one with the biggest number of hits. There you go, if that was your last one.
There you go.
Right. So we've got those to look forward to coming forward. But if we're looking at archery, we've got lots of questions. So before we get to those, questions from the people who've sent in, before we get to those, I have some that I drew up from pondering my way through this issue. But I wondered if a natural starting point might be that how far can we trace back archery, or is it even possible to trace back archery in warfare as opposed to just a hunting implement or tool?
I think that'll be very difficult to do. I mean, obviously we know that archery, bow and arrow, are a very old implement used by humans. I remember somebody, a book about very Bronze Age warfare that basically said the first weapons are a club probably, or the mace, which is, that's nothing else than a killing implement probably for people instead of trying to kill animals, because the sword is basically, you get a dagger or a knife and you make it longer. But the bow and arrow, of course, have been around for ages and ages. I don't know. It probably reliefs when they show up in the third millennium BC.
There's one mention in the magazine, in one of the articles, about some of the cave illustrations in Spain, I think it is, going back to 5000 roughly BC. But again, it's debatable whether they're being used for warfare or hunting or whatnot. And then I think it goes back down to about 3000 in terms of something that's more solid in actually saying it's for warfare as such.
So it's interesting that for the huge span, thousands of years of history. The magazine is sort of generally covering 2,000 years of history, and Mary points it out that it's kind of obscure. Is obscured by other forms of warfare, and I wonder why. Is it a social thing?
Yeah, Murray
thing?
Points very much to the the status aspect of archery. You can kill. It's almost the same as in the Middle Ages. You can kill an armored knight. An English longbowman can kill an armored knight from a couple hundred meters away, and that's just not very honorable. You're supposed to stand there until the guy comes thundering down the field and pokes you. And it's the same. It seems to be mostly the same for the Greeks and Romans, although it's not that's the same way necessarily for other peoples in the ancient world. But it just happens that the dominant image is Greek and Roman for us.
So was the spear, the pillar you're losing, you used in that? Is that not just as cowardly or sneaky and Eastern as the bow? Why is the bow sort of almost seems? I don't want to use the word stigmatized, but that's.
It's down to who's using it, because if you talk about any other form of weapon in the ancient world, it's not as. Or actually, maybe the sling. But arrows and slings are predominantly being used by auxiliaries in whatever army you're talking about, and so subsequently you don't really get any person of standing or any significant individual who's in particular who actually represents the ethnicity of the army majority actually using these weapons and. In the main, and therefore coming to prominence, and especially if you think about an army like Alexander the Great, where you've got his generals, who his named generals, they might fan out and get placed in roles of responsibility in lots of different units in different modes. You don't. Still, the archers and the slingers get missed out there. Nobody of prominence gets loved with those, because they're still the auxiliaries, no matter what. They're hired help, really.
It's maybe almost an upside down way of reasoning. I can afford a horse, I can afford expensive equipment, I can afford a sword. Therefore, what I do is more important than you. Or the sling is of course the cheapest weapon you can think of.
They are specialist units, because they are units that, I guess, in a lot of armies, they are hired in because they're trained, from a very young age. Here I'm thinking especially about Balearic slingers and whatnot, or Cretan archers. They are, from a young age, they are trained to specialise in that skill. Okay, you've got Roman legionaries who are told by people like Vegetius, you should know how to use a bow and arrow to a certain degree, but they're not being trained like these other specialists from such a young age. So subsequently, it is sort of, it's limited to a certain group, and that group is not the dominant group.
Yeah, but that is actually, I thought, kind of an interesting sort of undercurrent in this issue, that it's on the one hand, yes, it's the dominant group usually thinks, these are the hired help and they're not very important. But it's clear that they're almost always there. You go to just about any Roman camp that's been excavated, and you're going to find bow points, but arrow points. Even though we're pretty sure that there was no specialized unit there.
I'm not completely sure what my question is here, but so we might have to read between the lines. But I did wonder if we were oversimplifying it at times when we talk about peoples having archers. You mentioned the Cretians, Cretians renowned for archery and having archers. And an example, I can't remember if I think this is mentioned in the magazine, but the Egyptians didn't use bows until the Hyksos. Well, surely they did use bows because they have such an ancient history. Do we have this thing where they get mentioned more because it's, I don't know, something to do with this? They're mentioned in the sources for a reason, to flesh out the narrative with something that's more possibly understood at the time because there's some connotation added to them.
I think actually in the case of the Egyptians that Paul Elliott was trying to make the point that, they had straight bows, but the Hyksos introduced the composite bow. So it's a more modern version of the weapon, and that was then adopted and made effective.
In terms of the sources, they do get more of a look in when they've done something that maybe is not considered their normal role as such. So maybe there should be an assumption that going into most battles, yes, there are going to be archers involved in a softening up the enemy as such at the opening of a battle as the heavy infantry move in, etc. But then they get more of a look in when they do something like, going back to Alexander again, flushing out the Thracians from a wooded area, or, for example, adding support to a cavalry unit as they go in for the charge. So it's sort of, they only get highlighted when they actually do something out of the ordinary.
This might be a terrible broad generalisation, but I was going to say, is there a way that they were used in the ancient world? What was their standard? What was the archery unit used for? It might sound silly, but did they generally put them on the flanks, or are they always like infantry, or is it just a preposterous question?
It depends on which army you're talking about. You could talk about the Persians, and the Persians are actually, they use archers more as their mainstay soldiers. Each of their main soldiers in the Mede and Persian ranks are equipped with bows. They are a long-distance army. On the other hand, you've got archers in a Roman army that will also be equipped with, from inscriptional evidence, with swords. So they seem to be involved in hand-to-hand fighting if it comes to that. You've got other soldiers who are, we haven't mentioned so far, the archers on horseback in terms of be it Bactrian, be it Parthian, etc., or be it Romans later on when they start to adopt that sort of tactic. So I think every army does sort of manipulate archers for different use, and sometimes some armies change their mode of practice as well with them.
Do we know how they were trained? I mean, were they every Sunday afternoon chaps of you peasant farmers go out and practice, and the old medieval sort of way, or were they full-time trained archer units, or are these people who are sort of part-time called up when necessary? It's obviously a very specialised skill.
As Marc said earlier, you have these specialized units, such as the Cretans, and in the as the article points out, in the Roman era, not almost all, but a very large proportion of Roman auxiliary units that are specialized in archery come from the east. And I'd say that suggests that there is a local or a regional tradition in those areas where people are just, they grow up and they get this skill growing up, and then they join the army and they probably train more. But there must have been a culture of archery in some of those regions where people use them all the time, and maybe there was a militia. But if it's worthwhile to go out as mercenary units, you'd expect them to train all the time. I think Paul Elliott also mentioned something about training in his article about the Egyptian army.
It is curious how they come from the east, as does the composite bow. And I wondered if anybody came from northwest Europe, what did they have? Presumably not the composite bow, because it's from. And I think is it mentioned in you kind of need better weather to dry the wood and glue it.
It's almost the other way around. The article, it was suggested in the article that the composite bow comes around because of the lack of good wood to just make a self bow out of. It's a way to use all kinds of bits when there's no natural resource for self bows.
Perhaps if you go to that much effort to produce a weapon, you might have to put more effort into actually producing someone to fire it. Because presumably, if you're putting so much effort into creating a composite bow, which must be a highly skilled job, the weapon itself must take on more status. It does strike me reading through a lot of the archer stuff, a lot of things that I pulled out and made notes on all seem to be about status and social standing about the archer. The Romans didn't recruit archers from their citizenry. Again, there must have been a decision made that, or obviously they can take the specialists from elsewhere, but they must have decided that they weren't going to train up their own people for as archers.
But there do seem to be in the Roman armies. I can't remember where I was reading it the other day. There's mention of members of the legions being assigned as beast hunters in legions, and as part of that, they actually are armed with bows for that purpose. So that would sort of seem to argue that there is a certain amount of training going on even for citizen soldiers. I mean, in terms of the Romans. In terms of the Greeks, there is mention of citizens being involved as archers. We've got a mention, I think, in terms of Marathon, that there were some Greek archers or Athenian archers present at the battle in one of the sources. So there are these, native citizens being armed with or trained to some extent with bows. But in both those cultures, they are predominantly renowned for hiring in, like, for example, the Athenians hire in the Scythians when they need a police force in Athens. And, of course, the Romans, pretty much soon, you get to the middle of the Republic and there's all of a sudden, getting in all the, that's one of the main auxiliary units that they start getting in, either cavalry or archers.
Well, it is, I think mentioned in one of the articles that eventually the Roman legionaries do adopt the bow. I mean, I wonder what changes socially to allow them to make it acceptable.
There seems to be a change in the later Roman armies where ranged combat in general becomes more important. You get the plumbata, you get seemingly slightly more fixed formations. At least the infantry is more... perhaps more has a slightly more static role where they have their fulcrum, their shield wall, and lots of ways of raining down death from above. That's probably overstating it, but there seems to be a tactical change coming around.
It might, again, not go nowhere, but I wonder what legacy was for medieval warfare from the ancient world. I mean, were the two vastly different when it comes to archery?
Asking the wrong magazine.
I know I am. I thought they might. I was trying to go for the grey middle between the two. Because it kind of struck me you're essentially using the same implement, and I wondered if, how much growth you see change for. There's not. The sword has a long tradition, but the archer and the bow does the same thing, and I just wondered if that where they finished off, where the you don't put a stop and a start date on these, but I just wondered if where the Romans left off, that was it for archery development, and it didn't go much further, or did I don't know? I was looking for a thread there. I wondered if there was one. If there isn't, we'll move on.
By the end of the empire, the Romans are pretty much heralding in the start of what you'd consider medieval warfare, really. But again, as you say, where you draw the line, and where you want to go back to and say it's not really looking Roman now; it's looking more medieval. Yeah, debatable.
I kind of wondered whether medieval would actually look Roman and Roman look medieval. Would be any difference? Perhaps we should get Peter on from medieval warfare and have a crosstalk.
It depends on who you ask. Probably there's a lot of people who see Roman reenactors and go, "Look, knights." So.
Yeah, and then you've got the difference between the Western and Eastern empires. By that stage, that really there is starting to be a huge difference in terms of the weaponry and the tactics and whatnot, even between those two. So.
As we have a tremendous amount of questions to get through, shall we move on to some listener questions?
Yeah, try some.
We've got quite a lot from Patreon. If people enjoy the show, why not tip us $1 on Patreon? You'll only be charged when you only make a donation when we put a show out, so it's not like a monthly subscription or anything. So and most of these, a lot of these longer questions all come from our Patreon supporters, and we thank you for your support. So, Mike Hobbs on Patreon, and that's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. So Mike asks, I'm interested in the use of archers by early Persian armies. From what I've seen, all types of troops were in some way bow armed, and I wondered if this was just an oversimplification or if there was some evidence around this.
Well, the majority of them, yes, they are in some way armed with bows. I mean, you've got your what passes as Persian heavy infantry going for long-range tactics. I mean, they're so into it that they bring their own fortifications onto the battlefield and set up their defences in front of them so that they can start taking their pot shots. You've got your bows being introduced to cavalry as well in terms of the Persians, even with the Achaemenid Persians. There are heavy infantry, heavy cavalry, but I think a lot of the time they're sort of, they're not playing a distinguished role really in terms of Persian armies, you see.
If you try to think of the opposite, try to think of Persian units, typical Persian units that would close with the enemy, that is not the image we get out of our sources, I think. But that may be the bias on the sources part.
Mike also asks, does the team have any real information on Persian
Sparabara?
Yeah, Sparabaras. Do they think they would be used as pavisas and just pushed into the ground, similar to medieval archers, or if a front rank of troops held them and fought if engaged, while second ranks of troops would fire over them?
My understanding is there's both. My understanding has always been that there is. I'd have to check. It's whether the Sparabara is technically the shield with the stake behind it that you can just put down and then shelter behind whilst firing. There's also a device that the Persians bring on, which is a larger screen, which is placed in front of the front row, and which I understand they put spearmen behind so that it's a front defence in front of a then ranked archers. So, yeah, I'm a little shaky on exact terminology for both those devices. Well, I'm getting mixing the two up again. But, yeah.
Next question, David, Patreon. How were supplies of arrows kept up for the more missile-based forces? The medieval English had an almost national industrial system to keep their archers supplied. Did ancient civilizations have similar logistics? A slinger can pick up ammo almost anywhere, but where does an archer deep on campaign get his replacements?
I can't speak to how they were actually produced. I would guess that they were manufactured in workshops all across the ancient world and delivered to the armies. What I can say, though, is that there's one instance where, at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Parthian general, Surena, kept his soldiers supplied with arrows by organizing a train of camels, 1,000 camels, bearing arrows to deliver to his horse archers, because the Romans, after enduring a hail of these missiles, were hoping that the Parthians were going to run out of arrows and then they would be able to close with them, or at least or survive. But the Surena had more ammunition brought up, and so in that regard, it seems that from a logistical standpoint, arrows were someone had to make sure that these arrows were supplied in sufficient numbers and readied for the troops to be used.
Yeah, that's only the only example I can think of, and I think also after the battle, there must have been a lot of scavenging going on, trying at least to get the points, because they would have been valuable, and you can probably replace a shaft more easily. Presumably
to a limited extent. They're not. You don't necessarily need a specialist workshop to produce them. There must have been, as the bow was a hunting implement as well, they must have been able to fashion them throughout throughout the known world, as it were. And as an army passed through, it would be an opportunity for local people to sell their wares to the army.
But at the same time, you've got, like, in terms of the Balearic slingers, we know that there was production of the shots in terms of keeping them at a constant weight, shape and size. You'd assume that the same would probably go in at least the more professional armies, and those that are based, in one place for a long time especially, that they would be aiming at a good standard that's going to be allowing for training to actually come to fruition based on one weight and shape and size.
Alejandro references this, asks us about this. I don't know how many people have seen it. This video on YouTube by of a modern archer called Lars Anderson, and it's had 22 million hits on YouTube. I wish I'd put that video on YouTube. He's probably worth hundreds of dollars in YouTube advertising from all those hits. And basically, this guy claims the initial video claims he's rediscovered the ancient ways of archery, and this guy's jumping about all over the place. It's almost like watching some parkour gymnast dancing around, firing arrows, shooting arrows out of the sky, holding three in his hand and letting them off in swift succession. And there's a subsequent video, if you look for it, that is actually Lars Anderson himself kind of dumbing down the first video, saying, well, look, this is how I've interpreted it, and here's some of the sources, and this is how I do it, but I can do these things. And he makes a point about quivers, how they're not necessarily the best way to carry arrows. If you're moving about, you bend over and the arrows fall out. But anyway, so Alejandro says, how many assertions from these videos actually ring true? As he feels that, I think quite rightly so, that quivers does potentially sound a problematic, as we think of them now, certainly in the Hollywood films.
One of the questions that arose in my mind regarding archers in general was, what was the difference in terms of their effectiveness of their missiles if they could be launched at a relatively flat trajectory? That is, they were, I'm using the wrong term, but firing their arrow, launching their arrow at a target that was directly in front of them, as opposed to having to shoot into the air above the heads of their own soldiers. Because apart from the first rank of any archer, of unit of archers, and I'm guessing that these archers would have been stationed in relatively homogeneous units. The first rank is the only one that would have been able to fire directly at an opponent. Everyone else would have to fire over their heads, and it brings to mind just how effective is, or what's the difference in effectiveness between a directly fired arrow, which presumably would be the most deadly, as opposed to one where it's plunging fire. It brings to mind that most archers would have been using this plunging fire against their opponents. If we look at the tactical deployment of the Roman army used by Arrian in 135 AD, when he went out to go fight the Alans, which were a cavalry army, he had his archers deployed essentially all the way in the back and behind the Roman the legionaries. Now, I'm not certain whether or not he had them on higher ground, but whatever the case, almost certainly they were going to have to fire at some angle above the heads of their own soldiers. So when I look at what archers were doing, what they were capable of doing, most archers, I think, in battle, I don't think that they were engaging in what we would call sniping. I think what it was like an area effect weapon where you had hundreds of archers showering a particular target, or area, I should say, with arrows, and that's how they were primarily used.
On the other hand, I mean, you're talking about in battles, but at the same time, there's a lot of times in the sources where you come across mention of the archers being deployed with a light infantry force or an advanced force to harry another force. And I'm thinking, I can't remember which way around it is, when Eumenes is taking on Antigonus, and I think it is... is it Antigonus's forces find out that Eumenes' elephants have been left to winter away from the main army, and so subsequently he sends a team of archers to go and try and pick off some of the mahouts and whatnot, and Eumenes of course rushes to try and rescue his elephant unit before this light-armed infantry and archers group can go and pick off some of his trained valuable men. Another instance is Alexander in the Balkans campaigns, when he decides to separate from his main army and go ahead with the light infantry Pernians and some archers as well. They are targeting in particular, rather than just sporadic fire.
I do wonder, when reading through various sources, how much of the reports that we get from what I'll call conventional battles are focused mainly on either the heavy infantry or the heavy cavalry, let's say, and what happens is that the activities of the skirmishers are downplayed or ignored. There are a lot of times where I think, well, there were probably skirmishers or other light troops that were present on the battlefield because it would make no sense for them not to be there. And then we get, on the other hand, we have the example of Carrhae, where Plutarch describes what was going on, and he mentions that Crassus had with him light troops, but these light troops who tried to get to grips with the horse archers, the Parthian horse archers, who were devastating them. They just could not do it. They were completely ineffective trying to chase them down because the horse archers could get away. That leads me to believe that these light troops that were in Crassus's army were not themselves bowmen, or else they would have, I think, been able to deal with the horse archers more effectively. So in certain circumstances, it seems that the Romans, at least, were content to march out to fight without with little or no archery support. And so I wonder whether the assumption that they were there, that I would like to make, is not appropriate, considering that there are at least examples where the Romans just didn't have the archers in their army at all and suffered terribly for it.
But if we're thinking that they're getting underplayed in the reports, and we only hear about the archers when they do something, significant or unusual or whatnot, are we really going to hear about them when they do something wrong, necessarily? Is that going to be worthy of report itself? So in that case, they could be there, they could be doing something wrong, nobody bothers to tell us that they've done something wrong, they haven't done anything good, so...
We're going to get into a absence of evidence is evidence of absence type situation. I was thinking maybe the logistics thing is a very relevant question. That the Danish archer, if you lose 3 arrows, with one shot, and you have you have some kind of quiver, you got to have some kind, maybe one of those hip things that he had, and you have, I don't know, how many arrows could you put in there? 50? Be done in 15 shots. That's it.
I would have thought 50. We were lucky with that, to be honest. 50's, you get your the shaft as thick as your finger.
If it's less than that, you're done. You're out of ammo even faster. So that is automatically a limiting factor, unless you have some way of resupply.
I wonder if, because it's possible, doesn't necessarily mean it was so. Strikes me.
That's always that's the other one.
Because it strikes me as all that was, if you can fire 3 off in that, as you say, at that speed, all right, that's great. But as Marc points out, if you're firing massed ranks, firing at that speed almost becomes pointless, because within a very short period of time you're out and that you're spent and that's it done. At which point it comes down to what's the use of firing at that speed? Well, it's skirmishing. Well, even then, there must be an accuracy. You must lose some accuracy firing at that speed, at which point again it becomes somewhat moot. So just because you can somehow makes it doesn't make it.
We could also look at it from another point of view. I think something like 50 specialist archery units, auxiliary units, have been identified in the Roman Imperial Army. So that's 50 cohorts of just under 500 men, so under 25,000 archers. If they all existed at any one time, which of course also remains to be seen, that is only, 10-15% of all the auxiliaries in the 2nd century. Maybe 20. It depends on.
But are we reading their role in battle wrongly? Maybe we should be saying, well, are they out there to make a big dent in the enemy front line, or are they there to provoke? Are they there to throw them out in front of the army, put a couple of arrows into the opposition, and try and get them to make the first move on the battlefront?
I don't know. And it might be interesting. I don't know if anybody ever did trying to plot those units on a map and see, if they are mostly Eastern, do they stay in the East to be used against other archery heavy armies, or do they go elsewhere, where the opponents maybe do not use bow and arrow as much?
And they become the secret weapon to be deployed in some archerless region of the Empire.
something like that. It's very obvious that the Roman army, it depends on the heavy infantry. That is and always remains the core of what they do. But again, as an example that's mentioned in the issue, there are always others, both legionary and auxiliary, who know how to use a bow and arrow. The example of Soranus, the Batavian horse archer, or he acts as a horse archer, but he is in a Batavian ala. I think he says he brags that he, under the eye of Hadrian, he crosses the river, shoots an arrow in the air, and shoots the next one and to pick it out of the air. He does basically the same thing that this Dane does, except that on a horse. That's not a specialist unit, but apparently the guy was very well trained to be able to do that.
Well, that said, even Lars Anderson points out to do that is trickery and luck. It's more than anything else. There's obviously the skill involved, but even he says, it's luck. And they don't show you how many times he misses in the video. He might have been doing that all day to get the one shot. Wow. I'm sure I could do it if you could just give me enough, arrows. I'll just stand there all day, and eventually I'll manage to hit one. So, shall we move on? James, again on Patreon. I know Mike Loads has quite a lot of material out there about the effectiveness of medieval archery. I would like to know more about the effectiveness in antiquity. I presume it held more sway in the East due to the lighter kit of most infantry, but I would love a good argument on the subject. The Strategicon has some information on mounted... Yeah, that'll do. Has some information on mounted archery, but I wondered how much of that was a response to the steppe tribes. Thanks for the good work, gentlemen. There you go.
It would seem to be a very logical assumption that arrows would be more dangerous to unarmored soldiers than armored soldiers. That being said, the Romans at Carrhae, there are accounts where some of them had their arms, the arrow would penetrate their shield and go right through their arm, and they wouldn't be able to remove it, or they would actually have their feet stuck to the ground by an arrow that would penetrate. Certainly the Roman legionaries, presumably all wearing some type of chainmail cuirass, would have suffered mightily from these arrows. So while armor would have been much better than nothing, it was not proof against close-ranged archery. From what the account seems to relate is that the Parthian horse archers could get up very close and continue to shower the stationary Roman legions who had no ability to respond. That being said, one of the things about horse archery especially, and perhaps archery more broadly, is that it wasn't a weapon system that can be looked at in isolation. It has to be looked at relative to the other weapon systems on the battlefield. In that case, you had the cataphracts, the heavy lancers. Serena at Carrhae had only 1,000 of them. That being said, those lancers did at least have the ability to keep the Romans, in formation. That is if the heavy cataphracts could easily ride down dispersed legionaries. What would save a legionary from a charge of heavy cavalry was being massed with your fellows to either side of you, staying in ranks. But staying in ranks to fend off a cavalry charge made you a wonderful target for the horse archers. So, and they didn't even have to take aim at a specific target. They would just shower the area, and they would eventually hit something with their missiles. That type of combination, like a 1-2 punch, was used all throughout. the ancient world, and you see that the tactic was used effectively by the Sassanid Persians, where they developed a three-wave attack using first their heavy cataphracts would go on the offensive against the Romans. The Romans, of course, would be would bunch together, tight pack formation to repel them. Behind the cataphracts would come the horse archers. The horse archers would then shower these compacted Roman legionaries. And once the shower of missiles had done their damage, there'd be a third wave of the cataphracts following behind them to possibly charge home into the disordered Romans.
And to get back to the strategicon, I'm sure it's almost a gimme that's a response to the Sasanian armies that were proving so effective in the east.
This is, again, actually probably a nonsense question, but I was just thinking Northwest Europe would be much more forested. I wondered if massed ranks of archers is not quite as effective in you lose line of sight and things like that in wooded land than necessarily the Middle East, which would be possibly you get clearer lines of sight. Or is that just...
but presumably the Roman army would deploy in a more open area, because deploying in centuries and maniples in a wood is probably not very handy, despite what Gladiator would like to make you think.
I thought they went in and chopped down huge areas to have battles on, just like Gladiator. So there'd be just tree stumps everywhere, in Gladiator.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's the Persians. Persians like to clear their land before their battles.
So is have we got any more argument there?
It's in the end it comes back to what we've been saying all the time. It's just the archers are not interesting enough for most of the authors to write a lot about. So how effective they actually were is difficult to say.
Sometimes it's not down to how many kills they're making as well, but in terms of the Bactrians and the Parthians and whatnot, or Sogdians, the fact that they're riding in from, I think it's described as the dust clouds that they cause, taking a shot and being able to swiftly get out of there again, it's the shock value that might have actually had more of an effect than necessarily the number of kills that they're actually making. So that's got to be taken into account as well.
So our last question from Patreon. One question I've always had from Sean. Is why were the Macedonian phalanxes not more susceptible to missile weapons? It's always struck me this was the weakness of the formation, but it doesn't seem like this was the case. I read that the troops in the back ranks would hold their spears at an angle to help protect the formation, but I don't really see how one can knock an arrow out of the air with a 20-foot stick unless you're in a story by Tolkien. And the size of the shield, the density of the formation, etc., it seems it would present problems. Thanks again for looking at my question, and as ever, I enjoy the podcast.
I've come across that assertion before, that the rear ranks of the Macedonian Phalangites would hold their sarissai upwards, and that would somehow break the impact. That is, the arrows would clatter into these towering pikes, and they would fall presumably less dangerously onto their heads than otherwise. I think, though, that the key from a few of the battles that I studied where there was a combat between an infantry force and massed archery, the key to defeating archers was, whether horsed archers or foot archers, was to close quickly. So presumably the Macedonians would get across the battlefield and get stuck in with the enemy relatively rapidly, and not allow themselves to be cut up over time.
I think it's not necessarily moving in quickly, actually. In terms of Alexander's early battles, in terms of against the Persian forces, the archers seem to be on the one hand, the Persians seem to place them on their flanks to hold their flanks, and they seem to be facing similarly light-armed troops, whether it be archers or otherwise, on the flanks as well of the Macedonian army. And so subsequently, the Phalangites don't necessarily come face-to-face with archer infantry. At the same time, you've got the mention of the Macedonians using archers in between their cavalry ranks to add support there as well. So it's more that the Persian units, the Persian heavy infantry, or the Greek mercenaries that are being used by the Persians, are more likely to be coming up against arrows being fired at them rather than the Macedonian Phalangites. Later on, when you get to the successor generals, there seems to be there's the macho Macedonian versus Macedonian, get rid of all the the fancy stuff around the edges. It's phalanx on phalanx that's going to decide the matter and show who's the greater of the Macedonian generals. So I don't know that necessarily the archers that often have a crack at the Phalangites.
It does strike you as possibly being a super weapon, but possibly they never tried. So, Gavin from Facebook, after the defeat at the Battle of Cara, was the Roman army ever able to develop an effective unit of archers to counter the peoples of the steppes that the Romans would face in the future?
Well, clearly they won victories against the Parthians after that. It is, I think, for Cara, it's important to remember that it's not just a battle. It is very clear that both Dio and Plutarch make the story of the Roman army under Crassus being drawn into the desert, away from their supply, deeper and deeper into the desert, getting exhausted. It's very much a psychological story. They get, they're probably demoralized by the time the battle begins, and then they get to stand there and not be able to do anything back, because also their light infantry and their cavalry has been drawn off and destroyed pretty early on in the battle, and then just there's just pretty much the heavy infantry, and they're stuck. It's been a while that we did the Romans versus the Parthians issue 3-5, I think. There's other ways to do it. It's not just archery. Have the cavalry to drive off the Parthian cavalry, keep them at a distance, avoid battle, pick the terrain better, because the Carrai again seems to be in very open terrain, where the horse have completely free rein to go everywhere. So it's a combination of things, clearly, because it never happens that way again, though they definitely do get defeated.
The Romans also did develop their own cataphract cavalry, and some of these cavalrymen also were bow armed. So it would seem that the development of that arm was meant to take on armies that relied on mobility and firepower to win battles. So then they had their own counter to that over time.
Yeah, but cataphracts, I think, come in quite a lot later than compared to Carrai.
Oh, definitely after Carrai. It would seem, though, following up on your point, it would seem that if the Romans could avoid giving battle in open terrain, they had a relatively good chance against the Parthians. But the Parthians dominated very heavily in more open ground.
Well, we have a whole slew now of mysterious questions that Jasper's found from Twitter, so I have no idea who they're from.
Yeah, I should have looked that up, shouldn't I?
Well, I know. The relative strengths of the javelin versus the bow. What are the relative strengths?
Most of those questions are from Samai Huda on Twitter. And just the last one is from Frederick, where is he? Sillevold.
There we go. So here we go. Quick fire questions. What are the relative strengths of the javelin versus the bow? It sounds like a book from Osprey. Bestseller. I have to get it's Lindsay that penned the Osprey, didn't he? Rome versus the Barbarian, was it?
Yeah, a Roman legionary versus a Germanic warrior, I think.
So there you go. Jasper, strength of the javelin versus the bow.
Well, presumably the strength of the bow is that you can carry more ammunition. There's a longer range, but the javelin is cheaper, and it seems much more common to have javelin men than archers.
Presumably, it's a lot less skilled.
Yeah, I suppose so. But again, they're more or less throwaway troops, unless we're talking about, the pilum, which is essentially a heavy javelin.
Or when you get to, sorry to hark on about Alexander, but when you get to Alexander, you have him developing his, what starts out as being described as javelrymen, eventually end up as, trainee phalangites in the end, light arm phalangites. And gaining in status, so it's sort of a first step in his army to greater things later on. So, whereas you never see that with the archers.
In slightly earlier Greek history, the Thracian peltast and later mercenary peltasts are clearly become very important in warfare in the 5th and 4th centuries. Whereas archers are, they're there, but relatively a lot less well known. But it might be because the Thracians stand out because of their culture, their dress, their wonderful people to depict on pottery. Although you see archers on pottery too, but
they're not necessarily easily identified all the time. I mean, I'm thinking like the Agrianians in Alexander's army, they sort of get like a real kudos surrounding them, and which, for an auxiliary troop in any army, that's a real make.
There must have been also a big difference in the required skill to use a bow as opposed to a javelin. It would seem to me that if any soldier could take a javelin and hurl it with reasonable effect, especially if he was throwing it en masse with the rest of his fellows. Whereas if the English longbowman is representative of archers in general, it required years of practice to become truly proficient. So I think that an archer, to be a truly good archer, would require a lot more time, skill invested in developing your ability. And if we look to the very end, going to the end of the medieval period, which is far from the end of ours, apparently one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why gunpowder firearms superseded the bow relatively quickly was that you didn't need as much training to become proficient as an arquebusier in the 15th century, in the 16th century, as opposed to training with the bow. And then perhaps the same could also be said for the introduction of the crossbow too. That is, it didn't require quite as much skill to be used as effectively. So I think that an archer was one of the skilled workers of the ancient battlefield.
But just like you say, he's a skilled worker. At the same time, the question has to be asked, and I don't think there's any way that we can possibly answer this at the same time. But having been trained for such a long time and a lot of effort gone into it, I mean, if we look at longbowmen, bodies of longbowmen found in archaeological digs in more recent times, and the discovery that a lot of them have got overly developed shoulder muscles on one side, it has to be asked, well, what was the injury rate for bowmen? How likely were they, or how long were they going to serve as a career? Is this maybe a reason why you want to put more emphasis into javelrymen?
Is that some sort of repetitive motion injury or something like
Yeah,
that? I guess, yeah. I wonder about that. When I hear about the 150-pound pull weights on some bows, which were military bows, genuinely used in battle, that's really remarkable. I think I would need 3 arms to pull 150 pounds. That's a very impressive feat. It took a lot of skill to develop that type of muscular ability and whatnot. So I would say that. But the interesting thing is this. The javelin, well, I can't even say that the javelin disappears, for example, from the Roman army. I don't want to go that far. There was still there in the late Roman army, and it was being used by cavalry too, as a weapon to hurl. It would seem that the main difference between the javelin or any light thrown missile weapon that you might have had is that it would not have had the range of an arrow. It would have been shorter ranged. It would have been heavier. But as I said earlier, I think that just about anyone can throw it to some effect, especially when if you have 100 or 200 of your fellow soldiers around you and you're throwing it at the enemy, something would have struck home. And the javelin also is one of those things where, as the Romans used it from the Republican period well into the Imperial period, it was one of those things where they would likely have hurled it at the last moment before contact with the enemy infantry, whereas archers would not have run into battle and fired their arrows and then drawn their swords. That's not what archers did.
Yeah, complete difference of use, really. So, long range archery, more of a provocation, control of space, cause of fatigue. Short range archery, more likely to actually kill. Is that fair?
Seems like. I mean, I think the provocation and controlling of space and causing fatigue, I think we've discussed that pretty well by now. And it seems to make sense that if if an archer actually has the opportunity to aim at somebody from short range, that somebody is probably SOL.
You do have the example of Caesar arriving in Britannia and the covering fire being given from the ships being pulled up on his right flank. From a distance, but again, it's all down to intention. What was it? Was it just to give covering fire? Was it to take out a front row to allow them to gain the foothold on the beach? I think it's all down to interpretation.
That's also with catapults on the ship, I think. And you can easily imagine. Presumably, catapults were entirely foreign for the Britons. And
we know what happened to Maiden Castle, of course.
Yeah, exactly. A well-aimed catapult shot into a horse pulling a chariot is probably going to make an impression if that happens from a long distance.
So, super toughie. What was the better cavalry weapon, lance or bow?
Depends on the purpose.
They were two great weapons that were greater together.
Yeah,
I think that they with the purely lance arms cavalry, I think could be fended off with a proper composite arming that is heavy infantry backed up by archers and maybe your own artillery. It's not 100% clear to me whether or not, when Arrian describes the army of Alans that he fought in AD 135, whether or not the Alans were all armed with lances or whether there were horse archers with them in support. But I would think, though, that the advantage that an army would have with lancers is that it would be difficult to break infantry purely with lancers. That is, the the heavy infantry, as long as they stood solidly and didn't lose their nerve, horses, as it's often been said, will not charge stationary objects, and they won't drive the charge home into the infantry. Whereas if you have horse archers supporting those lancers, as you did at Carrhae and you did at several other battles between the Parthians and the Sassanid Persians later on, the horse archers can shower the Roman legionaries who are being rooted in place out of fear of the charge by the Parthian Persian heavy cavalry. So that and the Persian heavy cavalry, for instance, that would have held lances, and slowly over time, the Roman infantry would have been weakened under this hail of missiles, and then the cavalry could have delivered a shock charge and presumably cracked open the Roman battle line.
I think our final question we've really answered elsewhere. What can we know about the effectiveness of archers against armoured infantry?
Well, the one thing that we haven't discussed, and I thought of earlier, is that in the Middle Ages you see the bodkin arrow appear, the pyramid-shaped arrow that is specifically designed to pierce plate armor. And I don't think we have that style of arrowhead in the ancient world, but you do have that style for catapult bolts.
Which very effective against the Roman shields.
Yeah,
of that era.
Catapult bolts, and those catapults, if you've ever seen a reenactment group demonstrate one of those things, those are very effective, period. Scary, flat trajectory, very fast, long range. Presumably that the Romans would look to those for very well armored units.
There are some in the Spanish Wars, I think, in terms of arrowheads that are of a smaller, not that they do use barbed arrowheads, but also the non-barbed arrowheads as more aimed at the shields. I'm thinking here in terms of the War of Sertorius and whatnot.
And it also matters at what distance an arrow might be launched at any particular type of armor. No armor that's wearable by an ordinary human soldier is going to be 100% proof against an arrow launched from close range. I mean, it's probably a question of keeping the enemy at a distance, having a shield, and hopefully to take most of the blow for you. But I've come across the assertion that says that the Romans' lorica segmentata was made of a relatively flexible, softer steel, and that actually had enough give to it to not so much be proof against arrows, but to at least be fairly good protection against them.
That's not one that I've heard before.
I
cannot source it. I came across it.
Well, that's our marathon questions gone through. It's amazing how sometimes we put the call out for questions and we get nothing, and other times we're inundated.
Well, maybe we have to show the audience we try to answer them. We really do.
We do try to answer them. I just sort of sometimes think certain topics people are more brimming with questions with than others.
Yeah, could be.
So if anyone ever wants to leave a question, they can find us on Facebook or Twitter, or better still, why not become a Patron at Patreon/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Yeah, that's right. Because Patreon's got a dreadful search function on it. You have to put the thing in exact to find it. So we're Ancient Warfare Podcast. So Jasper has just dropped off the Hangout. So that's probably a good time to finish. So thank you, chaps. Next time we'll be in between issues of the magazine. So we're not sure what topic we'll be looking at. If you have any ideas, let us know, and we'll kick them about. We'll see what takes our fancy. You can find us on Facebook or Patreon, and that's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.